Now, I will request our festival personality, Utsav Murti, Professor Bibek Debroy, to come and give the bullet points how India can attain the $5 trillion economy in the Committee of Nations.
Sri Vidhu Shekhar Shastri ji, Dr. Anirban Ganguly, Sri Ajay Kumar Nandi, Dr. Dhanpat Ram Agarwal, Sri Vash ji. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Some of you may know that today there is, you said blue shirt, I first thought blue jacket. Some of you may know that today there is a seminar in Delhi organized by the Swadeshi Jagaran Manch. And they are quite upset that I decided to ditch them and come here instead. And I said in Delhi I only get Swadeshi. In Calcutta I get both Swadeshi and Shyama Prasad Mukherjee. So the choice is really a non-choice. Let me first say thank you to both Dr. Dhanpat Ram Agarwal and Dr. Anirban Ganguly for having invited me to a city that for obvious reasons I also identify with. My task is somewhat difficult because Dr. Agarwal has covered a very wide canvas. And if there is a speaker who's spoken before you and you find something to disagree with, then it makes your task easier. But there was nothing in what he said that I can fundamentally disagree with. So I am going to say what I have to say in somewhat unstructured fashion in 4 different segments. Those of you who came here at the beginning will have noticed that Dr. Agarwal presented me with this, and that's the reason I brought it here. There are 6 roses in it, and he said 10 minutes per rose. So he told me to speak for 1 hour. But the reason I'm brandishing this is a rose always has thorns. And the introduction said that I have done some work on our traditional texts. In our traditional texts, the rose, and you can read them up if you don't believe me, is a very unimportant flower. It does not feature prominently. The flower that features prominently in our texts is actually some variety of the lotus. So I'm slightly puzzled why I'm being given a rose, which reminds me of the school texts where we studied quite a bit about the Mughal Empire, and every Mughal emperor or Mughal empress would be seen holding a flower, which is a rose. So I recommend to the Swadeshi Research Institute that the next time round, do think of the lotus, because we heard that invocation at the beginning to the goddess Saraswati, Shveta Padvasana. Well, Lakshmi also sits on a lotus. One happens to be a white lotus, and the other one happens to be a red lotus. If both of them are seated on lotuses, and if we need both the wealth and the education to get to that 5 trillion, then perhaps I should return this to you. I said I'm going to divide what I'm going to say in 4 segments. The first segment, I don't really know what to give a name to, but it will become clear as I develop it. The next segment will be on the 5 trillion that Dr. Dhanpat Ram Agarwal has spoken so eloquently about. The third segment will be about the economic vision of the Modi government, not just 2.0, but 1.0 spilling over into 2.0. And the last segment will be specific to the budget. So this is the structure. প্রথমে আমরা শুনলাম ধন ধান্যে পুষ্পে ভরা আমাদের এই বসুন্ধরা। কাদের বসুন্ধরা? To make this country prosperous, whose responsibility is it? And there is a reason why I'm flagging this. Because if you read the Constitution, which all of us should, because the framework for everything that we do is there in the Constitution, if we read the Constitution, the preamble to the Constitution says, we the people. It does not say, they the government. Particularly now that I work for the government, and I worked for the government in the past also, in the mid-90s, whenever you work for the government, and even more so now, people will come to you and say, the government should do this, the government should do that. Why doesn't the government do this? The responsibility of making this country a prosperous country, the responsibility of ensuring that we reach that 5 trillion is not the government's responsibility alone. It is the responsibility of we the people. In the budget speech, the finance minister quoted Kautilya. Not from the Arthashastra, from Chanakya Niti. The economic survey this year quotes from another text. The economic survey, well, most people don't read it. It's normally a very boring document. It isn't that boring this year, but normally people don't read it. But one of the chapters quotes from another document written by Kamandaka or Kamandaki. And the reason I'm mentioning this is if I ask all of you, tell me the name of a text going back to much before Adam Smith, which talks about governance, which talks about government policy, which talks about taxation, which talks about expenditure, he will probably name Arthashastra. But Arthashastra is only one text. Kamandaka or Kamandaki's Niti Shastra is another one. There are extensive sections on governance, taxation, and so on and so forth in at least 11 other texts, including the Mahabharata, in Shanti Parva and Anushasana Parva, when Bhishma is lying down on his bed of arrows and is instructing Yudhishthira. There are sections on these also in the much maligned and rarely read Manu Sanghita. Why am I harping on this? The reason I'm harping on this is in that day and age, if you read those texts, there was a very limited role for the government. I'm not using the word dharma in a metaphysical and spiritual sense, in the sense of moksha dharma. I'm using the word dharma in a general sense. If you look at the structure of dharma, there was the king, today's government. And there was the community. And there were individuals. So there was a three-layer structure of governance. The king did very limited things. The king ensured defense, external security, internal security, speedy dispute resolution, protection of property rights, punishing the wicked, protecting the virtuous. There the king's responsibility ended. Who did the other things? The community did. Who did the other things? The individual did. Do you think there was a Competition Commission of India then which examined things like unfair trade practices and restrictive business practices? No. The Srenis or the guilds did that. Who ensured MRP? The Srenis or the guilds did that. Who ensured skill formation? The Srenis or the guilds did that. You don't have to go back thousands of years. The British documented everything in sight. And they authored, amongst other things, things known as the district gazetteers. Initially, they authored gazetteers for all of India, and then they authored gazetteers for individual districts. Ambala District Gazetteer in the year 1883. What's happening in 1883? In 1883, a canal has to be built in Ambala. A canal has to be built in Ambala in 1883. How much is that canal going to cost? In 1883 rupees, that canal was going to cost, I'm approximating, rounding it off, was going to cost 45,000 rupees. In 1883 rupees, this canal was going to cost 45,000 rupees. How much did the government of the day contribute? The government of the day contributed 20,000. Who contributed the remaining 25,000? The community did. I'm not talking about thousands of years ago, 1883. Today you suggest something like this and there'll be controversy. Why are we paying taxes? It is the government's responsibility to do everything. Now, if we are going to discover and rediscover our heritage and our legacy, it is also to rediscover this legacy of we the people. The government is an island in an overall ecosystem. You cannot suddenly expect the government to become an island of excellence when the rest of the ecosystem is one of irresponsible behavior, low productivity, and no competition. It doesn't work like that. In my current job, a lot of people from industry come to meet me. The government should do this for us. The government should do that for us. Why isn't the government more efficient? Why is bureaucracy so inefficient? So on and so forth. As you have gathered, I now work for the government. As you may not have gathered, I now live in government accommodation. So because we moved to government accommodation, like dutiful citizens, I and my wife, we wrote to our respective banks. And before you think this was a public sector bank, no. The three banks that we are talking about between the two of us are prominent private sector banks. So we wrote to them saying, we have shifted house, please change our mailing address. Bank said, where are the property papers? I said, there are no property papers of the house. Where is the tenancy agreement? I said, there's no tenancy agreement. Where are the utility bills? I said, there aren't any. The government pays. This went on for 6 months. 6 months. Then on a Sunday evening, my wife tells me in exasperation, what is this? You're trying to determine policies for the country and you can't even get your bank address changed. So on Sunday evening, I sent SMSs to the heads of these 3 banks. I will not name them. Obviously, I knew them. On Monday morning, the addresses were changed. All of us here know that in 1991, there were significant reforms in India. In 1992, I conducted a very juvenile kind of experiment. I went to CII FICCI, I did not come to ICC. I went to CII FICCI, ASSOCHAM, got their lists of members, drew up a list, Hall of Fame of Indian Industry, 1,000. And I wrote to them, complaining about trivial matters. What kind of trivial matter? Well, one biscuit manufacturer, I said, I buy your cream biscuits and half the time I find the cream is on the wrong side. That kind of trivial complaint. Out of 1,000, 4 replied. 996 did not reply. 4 replied and said, our authorized representative will call on you soon. It's been so many years, the authorized representative has not turned up except for one company. In the introduction, it was said that I was involved as a chairman of a committee that recommended reforms in the railways, in the course of which we traveled by train throughout the country. When I say traveled by train, I do not mean the Rajdhani and the Shatabdi, ordinary trains. One of these trains, an ordinary train, had stopped in the middle of the night at about 2:30 in the morning in a not that famous station in the state of UP for a Rajdhani or a Shatabdi to pass. And we found out that the train was going to stop there and wait there for about half an hour. So we got off. We were walking up and down the platform. 2:30 in the morning. And there was no one else there on the platform. Deserted railway platform, except there was a food stall. We see a tall, hefty person go up to the food stall. He buys a packet of chips, eats the chips, and throws the wrapper on the platform. And I can see my wife advancing towards him. And I can anticipate what is happening. I'm following her at a slight distance. Remember, I told you he was tall, hefty. And pretending I don't know her, but I cannot very well distance myself completely. So she goes up to him, taps him on the shoulder and says, pick that up and put it in that kachre ka dabba. And I thought, here we go. He picks it up, puts it in the garbage bin. And we marvel at this, and both of us go to the food stall owner and say, this is unheard of. Do you know what he said? He said, before the Swachh Bharat mission, this would not have happened. And one thing that I think you should all recognize is one of the things that the Prime Minister is trying to do, and this is also stated in slightly technical language in the economic survey, is to bring about the behavioral change, because without that behavioral change, we will not be able to get a prosperous India or even that 5 trillion. And you can see it happening. It is happening gradually. It is happening in the voluntarily giving up of LPG subsidies. It is happening in the health sector. And the more and more this happens, the more and more we recognize যে এই বসুন্ধরাটা আমাদের, এই দেশটা আমাদের, সরকারের শুধু না, the sooner this will happen. So this is the first point I want to make before you, that please, we need to change our mindsets about the government being able to do everything. I will leave one number with you before I move on to the next segment, one figure with you. Today, the union government and state governments together collect 17% of GDP as taxes. 17% of GDP is collected as taxes by union government and state government. Add up the demands on public expenditure. We must spend 4% of GDP on health. We must spend 6% of GDP on education. 4 plus 6, 10. We must spend 10% of GDP on infrastructure. 20. We must spend 3% of GDP on defense. 23%. Where is the money going to come from? Either we are prepared to pay more, or we must tailor our expectations according to the consideration that, as Dr. Agarwal said, today our per capita income in US dollars, I don't think you gave this figure, so I'm stating it. Our per capita income in today's dollars today is 2,000 US dollars. 2,000 US dollars, is it high, low? There was a famous economist named Lord Keynes, and a lot of clever things which you do not know who said them, they are invariably ascribed to Lord Keynes. So Lord Keynes apparently once asked, how is your wife? And he said, compared to whose wife? So like that, 2,000 US dollars, is it high or low? Well, the richest country in the world has a per capita income of about 175,000 US dollars. In the 1870s, not 1970s, in the 1870s, the United States had a per capita income of 3,000 US dollars. We are at 2,000 US dollars. So it's all very well to go to Western Europe, it's all very well to go to North America, and it's all very well to demand that the government in India should do all of these things, but let us recognize that we must do an apples to apples comparison. Let us not compare India with those countries as they are today, but let us do a valid comparison with what those countries were like 50 years ago. Now, let me move to the next segment, which is about the 5 trillion. India's GDP is in rupees. So why are we talking about a dollar figure? The reason for that is whenever we want to make comparisons, particularly inter-country comparisons, cross-country comparisons, I need a common currency in which I can express it. And because of the importance of the United States economy, whether we like it or not, maybe 50 years from now it may be the rupee for all we know, Indian rupee, I don't mean other countries' rupees. It happens to be the US dollar. Which means that somewhere in that conversion, we must have a view about the exchange rate. Because we are talking about the dollar figure, we must have a view if we are projecting about what that exchange rate is going to be. And economists have models. Let me assure you, those models tell us absolutely nothing about what that exchange rate will be. Those models predict something, and later on all the economists will be very good at explaining why what happened did not conform to the model. But in advance, no one is in a position to exactly predict what that exchange rate can be or should be. On the basis of the relative rate of inflation, I can argue that there should be, not will be, there should be some depreciation of the rupee vis-a-vis the dollar. On the basis of expected capital inflows, which Dr. Dhanpatram Agarwal mentioned, I can argue that when an economy does well, the exchange rate tends to appreciate. Sitting here today, I don't know whether it is going to appreciate, I don't know whether it is going to depreciate. Calcutta, people love football. We watch football and we watch penalty kicks being taken. Now what the goalkeeper does is very important. Here the goalkeeper, I am taking the penalty kick. As a goalkeeper, you don't know whether it will be to the left or whether it will be to the right or it will be in the middle. Roughly, let's say one-third probability. So actually, I should just stand there and not jump in either direction. But if I don't jump in either direction, all the spectators will say the goalkeeper is stupid. So every goalkeeper will jump in this direction or will jump in that direction. Exactly similarly, since I don't know whether the rupee will appreciate or depreciate, I should say it's probably going to remain where it is today. On the basis of that, to get to $5 trillion, we need a nominal rate of growth of around 11.5 to 12%. A nominal rate of growth, 11.5 to 12%. A nominal rate of growth is real rate of growth plus inflation. To understand the formulation of Indian economic policy, 4 numbers are pretty useful because policy formulation is on the basis of these 4 numbers. And what are these 4 numbers? 2, 4, 6, and 8. The current account deficit to GDP ratio, we should try to keep at 2%. I'm not saying they will be, I'm saying policy is driven by these 4 numbers, 2, 4, 6, 8. So the current account deficit to GDP ratio should be 2%. The inflation rate, to be technically correct, as measured by the GDP deflator, should be 4%. So that's a 4. The combined deficit of the union government and the state governments should be 6% of GDP, and the rate of growth should be 8%. So that's why I said 2, 4, 6, 8. So let's come back to that inflation rate, to that nominal rate of growth of 11.5 to 12%. What is going to be the inflation rate? The inflation rate, as I just said, has been, and that is what the RBI also targets, 4%. So if I take away 4%, what am I left with? 7.5 to 8%. So the aspirational rate of growth in real terms is 7.5 to 8%. As Dr. Agarwal said, we used to do 8%. Now we are trundling along at 7%. So it means we should not actually aspire to 8%. We should probably aspire to 8.5%. Now I can begin to slice it in all kinds of different ways. One way to slice it is in terms of the macroeconomics, which is what Dr. Agarwal has done a little bit. If I look at the overall rate of growth, it can only come from 4 sources. There are only 4 possible sources from which I can get that overall rate of growth of 8% or 8.5%. One is net exports. The point to note about net exports is the world economic environment today is not very favorable. Countries are fighting, and sometimes fighting over rational reasons, and sometimes fighting over irrational reasons, and those are affecting, amongst other things, tariffs, and there is a rising tide of protectionism. So if I just look at exports, or if I look at net exports, yes, we want them to increase, but it does not seem to be very plausible to me that net exports will be a major contributor in that rate of growth. The next item that I have is government expenditure, public expenditure. The obvious point to note about public expenditure, and I will have a little bit more to say on this in the 4th segment, the obvious point to note about public expenditure is that if a government is profligate, it has costs, increasing and increasing the rate of inflation. And one of the great successes of Modi government 1.0, and therefore it is a stated policy of Modi government 2.0, is that inflation must be kept under check. And therefore, fiscal consolidation is important. Why? Because I look at the next most important component of national income growth, which is investments, public investments, but all primarily private investments. So I want to ensure that private investments pick up. And indeed, there is an investment climate issue. But do remember, this is a union government in Delhi. India, rightly so, is a democracy. In a democracy, under the constitution, there is not only the executive arm of the government, there is parliament, there is judiciary, and there are the legislatures and state level courts and lower courts. We may have problems with them, with their functioning, but as institutions, they need to exist. And given the fact that we pride ourselves in being a democracy, we should recognize that this is not China, where suddenly the executive arm of the government assumes all kinds of powers and trundles over the rights of these institutions. And also to add to that, I keep saying union government, there is a constitution. Under the constitution, there are roles for the union government, there are roles for state governments. The 8 to 8.5% growth rate will not happen in Delhi. The 8 to 8.5% of growth rate will happen at the level of the states. So our expectations and our demands and our aspirations will have to take that into account. But to continue to what I was saying, and to continue with Dr. Agarwal's figures, except I'm not going to cite the figures, is we want the savings rate to increase. We want the investment rate to increase. And we do not want the government to crowd out private investments. Remember, he gave you a figure of the incremental capital output ratio of 4. He also talked about efficiency, productivity, bringing that down. Maybe yes, maybe no, I'm not disagreeing with him, but it's not going to happen in a hurry by 2024. So essentially, the savings rate needs to go up and the investment rate needs to go up. It used to be at far higher levels, but to get that 8 to 8.5%, that's what we need to do. The second way of slicing it is by not looking at the macro, but looking at the micro. And if you ask any microeconomist, how does growth happen? He or she will tell you there are factor inputs and there is productivity. What are the factor inputs? The factor inputs are land, or if you don't like land, natural resources. They are labor, and I'm using the word labor in a broad sense, not just labor laws, but also education, health, all of that. We are talking about capital and we are talking about productivity. And all four markets need to function efficiently. In 1991, we began to witness the first instances of competition. Competition means free entry. It also requires free exit. Much of the resistance that you witness today is for the first time since 1991, under Modi government 1.0, capital is being threatened with the danda of exit. That is one reason why there is such a lot of screaming and shouting. Not the only reason, but one reason. I can go on and on about reforming land markets and capital markets and making them more efficient. The only point I want to make is much of this under the 7th schedule is in the state list. Which brings me to the point that Dr. Anirban Ganguly made. That growth rate of 8 to 8.5% is aggregated, state level upwards, unless you are talking about railways, unless you are talking about national highways, unless you are talking about defense, which are in the union government's list. There is plenty of slack in the system. If I look at the rates of growth in states over the last 10 years, I will find that there are states which have attained rates of growth of 9%, sustained over a period of time, rates of growth of 8.5%, sustained over a period of time. If some of those states, particularly in eastern India, increase their rates of growth from a rough average today of about 6%, 6.5%, by even 2 percentage points, we will easily get to that aggregate 8.5%. If nothing else happens, but the female work participation rate increases in eastern India, we will easily get to that 8.5%. Now let me move on to the third segment, which is about the Modi government 1.0 spilling over into 2.0. And this is important to realize because a lot of people looked at this budget and said, what is in this budget for me? Remember the first point I said? We should stop asking what is in this budget for me, and we should begin to ask what is there in this budget for this country. Unfortunately, our mindset is one of, I describe it as the Narayan Dutt Tiwari 88-89 Sindoor budget, when the excise on Sindoor of all things was changed. Our mindset about the budget is that the budget will come along, will change taxes on this, will change taxes on that. So I go and buy my cigarettes before the budget. That's been our mindset. But the remarkable element and the understandable element about this particular budget is that this budget is part of a continuous process of what the Modi government has been doing since 2014. And let us also not forget that there was an earlier budget in February of 2019. All of this is a continuation of that. The way we look at the budget is we tend to think, that's the way we normally look at it, we tend to think that government functions only on budget day. Other 364, 365 days of the year, the government goes to sleep. Doesn't work like that. So the budget is an incremental little piece in what the Modi government has been trying to do. So what, in very bulleted kind of fashion, has the Modi government been trying to do? In very bulleted kind of fashion. Firstly, no government can afford to abdicate its responsibility. What do I mean by that? There are 600,000 villages in India. After so many decades after independence, we should have been ashamed that before 2014, many of these villages lacked decent roads, lacked electricity connections, lacked primary health centers, lacked LPG connections, and all of these things. So the primary call on government resources must be on these disadvantaged sections. The primary call on the government's limited resources cannot be on the relatively rich. I will talk about taxes later, but cannot be on this. It was mentioned in the introduction that I was born in Shillong, which is now in Meghalaya. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Northeast. This being Calcutta, several of you are. You have no idea how important psychologically, if nothing else, it has been that for the first time, so many years after independence, I have a railway connection in my state. For the first time after so many years, I have an airport in my state. For the first time after so many years, I am not regarded as something that is alien to mainstream India, but I am being integrated. So one priority for the Modi government 1.0 and for Modi government 2.0 is, as economists we can debate what the government should be doing and what the government should not be doing, but it is fairly clear that certain areas of physical infrastructure and certain areas of social infrastructure are primarily the responsibility of government. So this is the first bulleted point. The second bulleted point is, all said and done, there will be people who will be deprived and they will need to be subsidized. How do I decide who is deprived? How do I decide this? The only way I can decide this is by doing a decentralized identification. People's memory is very short, so people don't remember that in 2004, UPA 1 had promised in paragraph 38 of the President's speech, of the then President's speech to Parliament, that decentralized identification of the poor will be done in the first 100 days. Did anything happen? Nothing happened. Modi government 1.0 is the first one which has used decentralized identification through the SECC, the socio-economic census, across a wide variety of government programs, not just union government but also state government. The SECC is now being used to identify beneficiaries. I'm not going to use the word poor because there are different deprivation criteria. Of course, there are challenges because the SECC is old, it's 2011-12, it has to be updated. But I'm sometimes surprised why the media does not talk about the SECC. Whether you agree with the policies of the Modi government or you don't agree with the policies of the Modi government, this has been a very, very important change of decentralized identification, which is increasingly being linked to direct benefit transfers. There is a challenge. And again, I'm surprised why media does not write that this is a big challenge which the government needs to solve and which the government is in the process of solving. And what do I mean by that? The DBT is individual based. SECC is household based. All the other schemes that we are talking about, whether it is the LPG, whether it is the electricity, they were household based. For the first time, we now have an individual-based program, which is the health scheme. So I now need to integrate the two databases of SECC and Aadhaar, integrate the household database with the individual database to completely transform governance as we know it. And once we do this, the efficiency of government expenditure will increase many times. Also, I find that people do not discuss, and again press does not write about it. Everyone talks about MSME. What is MSME? I don't know. What is the point I'm trying to make? An enterprise has to have a legal identity, which is different from Vyasji's individual identity. It is easy if the entity, if the enterprise is registered under the Companies Act. But 97% of India's enterprises, and certainly the MSMEs, they are not registered under the Companies Act. So I need to establish a legal identity for MSME. Now, I will not get into the details of how the government is doing it, but it's a very important piece in the jigsaw because, again, some of you will know that this is for the first time under Modi government 1.0 that we have satisfactory exit provisions under IBC for MSME. But to make that work again, I need a legal identity for MSME. The next point, bulleted point, which people again don't seem to appreciate in terms of the importance of that, is the decentralization. For years and years, people complained about governance in India, saying that India was excessively centralized. It was centralized under the British because of colonial reasons. It continued to be centralized after 47 because of planning reasons. And several people have said, decentralize. If you notice, I have constantly used the word union government. Normally, I have not used the word, and I don't use the word center. Why? Center suggests that there is a center sitting there, and everything else is a periphery. The word center, or the expression center-state relations, does not occur in the Constitution. The expression that occurs in the Constitution is union. Bharat, India is a union. And again, what is sometimes not appreciated is the recommendations of the 14th Finance Commission. Recommended that the untied devolution to states should increase from 32% to 42%. It would have been very easy for the union government to say, there is the pay commission, there is OROP, there is this, that and the other. We will increase it from 32 to 37%. And the other 5% we will think about later. I don't think this government has got adequate credit for the recognition that it was increased to 42%. On top of the 42%, we also have devolution from the union government to the states under the umbrella of central sector and centrally sponsored schemes. Earlier, the Planning Commission used to determine the nature of these central sector and centrally sponsored schemes. Under Modi government 1.0, it would have been very tempting for the government to say that Niti Aayog should do this. Instead, what did the Prime Minister do? He appointed a committee of chief ministers. In fact, he appointed 3 different committees of chief ministers, one for the centrally sponsored schemes, one for the Swachh Bharat mission, and one for skill development, chaired by 3 different chief ministers. So they determine the nature. So the simple point, or the simple number to remember is today, about 63% of public expenditure happens at the level of the states. 63%. About 50% of investments happen at the level of the states. All the time you will find newspapers and all kinds of people discussing what is NK Singh going to say in the course of the 15th Finance Commission. Do you find people discussing the state budgets? No. Not normally. Do you find people discussing state finance commissions and their recommendations? Normally, no. We can go around and ask a question about what public goods and services do you expect the government to deliver? And each one of us will have an answer. But most of these public goods and services will be delivered at the level of the local body. It will not be delivered by the union government. It will not even be delivered by the state government. It will be delivered by the local body, municipality or panchayats. Do we even discuss the devolution from the union government to the state government? One of the things that this government is trying to do is to have a debate and a discussion on something else which I want to flag. Remember what I said earlier about scarcity of resources? Who decides what government should spend money on? When I say government, I'm not talking about union government. All governments, union government, state government, local government, who decides? All the time, you will find state governments saying, give us more money. Should the union government spend on health? You will say, yes, the union government should spend on health. Why? Because health is important. But where is health in the 7th schedule? In the state list. If health is on the state list, then why should the union government spend on health? After all, that is the reason why this fiscal devolution to the state governments is happening. On the other hand, if you argue that health is so important that union government should contribute, you should also agree that defense is important, national highways is important, railways is important, and therefore the state government should contribute to those. You may or may not have a view about the GST, but do recognize GST is not the ideal terminal goal yet. It is work in progress. But one thing we will have to grant is that we have had a phenomenal success in the GST Council as a decision-making body which has decided the structure of GST and has involved cooperative federalism at its best, namely cooperation between the union government and the state governments. But that is on the tax side, that also on the indirect tax side. What I am flagging before you is the 15th Finance Commission will submit its recommendations towards the end of the year. The centrally sponsored schemes that I mentioned, they expire on 31st March 2020. They are coterminous with the recommendations of the 14th Finance Commission. So from 1st of April 2020, we have a new package of schemes and we have the new recommendations of the 15th Finance Commission. And my submission to you is just that we have had phenomenal success with the GST Council as a cooperative decision-making body between the union government and the state government. We now need an equivalent body to decide on what important items should be included in public expenditure. Is it going to be national highways? Is it going to be railways? Is it going to be defense? Is it going to be health? Because if you remember that figure of 17% that I mentioned earlier, and 23%, there isn't an infinite kitty. We have to do our prioritization. Now, let me come to the last segment, which is the budget. The best way to look at this budget, and Dhanpatji, if you are going to report this to Nirmala ji, please quote me accurately, otherwise she will be very upset with me. The best way to understand this budget is to understand that budgets are going to become irrelevant. And this is the first link in the chain. What is a budget? A budget under the Constitution is an annual statement of the government's receipts and expenditure. Nothing more and nothing less. We have come to equate the union budget with the announcement of big policy changes. Why? As I said, there are another 364, 365 days. Why do I have to make all those announcements on budget day? Simply because that happened in 1991. On the expenditure side, everything that is there in the budget is a continuation of the investment schemes, of the public expenditure schemes that were part of Modi government 1.0 and continued into Modi government 2.0. So why is everyone surprised that the union budget has not increased expenditure on this, that and the other? The expenditure part of it was already pre-announced. So what were you expecting? I don't understand. So now we come to the tax part. On the tax part, I said GST is work in progress. Yes, we should streamline the GST rates, reduce the number of rates. Yes, more and more products should become part of GST. But whose right is it to decide on the GST rates? It is the GST Council's right. It is not the Union Finance Minister's right. So on the indirect tax side, there is nothing the Finance Minister can do. The Finance Ministry can take it up with the GST Council, but it will be the GST Council which will announce. Which brings me to the direct tax side. What is the simple story on the direct tax side? The simple story on the direct tax side, as I told you, a lot of people come to me to use up. They come to me saying, want to have a cup of tea with you or a cup of coffee. And then it transpires they don't want to have the cup of tea or the cup of coffee or find out how I am. They want an exemption for themselves, a tax exemption for themselves. And the general argument is, you retain the exemption for me, remove the exemptions for everyone else. You do not simplify taxes that way. The only people who benefit from that are chartered accountants and lawyers. So the direct tax reform agenda is very simple. Why do you think I was looking in that direction?
No longer practicing.
That is because of the reforms. So on the direct tax side, the direction to reforms is to eliminate exemptions. Because until you eliminate exemptions, you will also not be able to reduce the compliance costs of paying taxes, nor will you be able to reduce the heavy hand of the inspector. Please don't misquote. All machinery requires oil and grease. And a government machinery is no different. So the more we reduce the impact of that machinery, the more we reduce the human interface, the better it will be, and it will become better and better as we reduce exemptions. If we reduce exemptions, that is truly when the direct tax rates can come down. What has this got to do with the budget? As you should know, a task force has been set up to recommend a direct tax code. Is going to submit its recommendations at the end of July. Until I have its recommendations, what do you expect me to do as the finance minister? If I introduce some changes, I will be criticized in the media saying all of this setting up of the task force is hogwash. You did not even wait for the recommendations, you introduced this change, that change. So, this is why I said, I don't understand what people's expectations were about the budget. Because the task force on taxes had not submitted its recommendations. So, at best, you could tinker a little bit here, tinker a little bit there, and reduce the importance of the inspector and move increasingly to reducing the human interface so that corruption becomes less and less. The processes, which is what the budget has done. Why did I say this is the last budget? We are at a cusp, not this first link in the last budget. I explained to you that expenditure, we need that debate. When we have that debate from 1st of April 2020, expenditure is not going to change from year to year. Which means part A of the budget speech goes. GST determines indirect taxes. The tax exemptions go, so direct taxes are cast in stone. Part B of the budget speech goes. So, in 2024, I am confident we will have that 5 trillion. But I'm even more confident of the fact, and again, please don't misquote, that the finance minister will stand up leading up to the elections of 2024 and say, this is independent India's last union budget speech. Thank you very much.